you're not here to change anybody's mind, but to learn more about how somebody different than you thinks.
Your guide as we go through this process of figuring out how we can be kind and present as we go about doing great things. Today, we get a chance to talk with Mark Matlock. I've known Mark for quite a while. I'm thinking going back into the mid to late 90s, when we were both involved in youth specialties, presenting at their conferences, doing teaching and writing for them. Mark is a speaker, an author, a facilitator. Sometimes you can think of him as a nonprofit executive for hire. He currently has a book out called Faith for Exiles, former director of youth specialties, and also founder of Wisdom Works Ministries. So you can see why we're kind of connected on that whole wisdom thing. He also is a presenter and deeply involved with the Barna Group. So today we want to look at some of the stuff he's working on. But Mark, welcome. So glad that you can join me for a little bit.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, that was a lot of stuff. I'm the slash king with all those all those descriptions.
Yeah, but it leads for interesting stuff. Tell me, what is currently happening in your world?
Yeah, well, currently I'm supporting the book Faith for Exiles, helping a lot of organizations and churches that want to use the insight from the research that David and I did to apply it into their organizational or institutional context. Helping them.
Real quick, David who? You threw
David Kinnaman.
Okay.
Yeah, David Kinnaman, the president of Barna. He and I, gosh, we've probably known each other about the same amount of time that you and I have known each other, John. And we just spent a lot of time thinking a lot about the next generation and what's going on in their lives. So we did some research with 18 to 29-year-olds. So just helping groups take that insight and turn it into action. Insight's great, but now what do we do with it? And that's kind of what I've been helping a lot of people do. I've also been involved in a project that you've helped me with, Better Man, which is a program to help younger men kind of understand a compass for their masculinity, and continuing to do some other work with Barna as well, helping facilitate different city movement things and other research things for the faith-based community.
Yeah. Really interesting stuff. Before we get too far into your current place, tell me a little bit about your journey, why Wisdom Works, how did you get there, what interested you about, why would you call your organization Wisdom Works?
Yeah, probably because I'm foolish enough to do so. You named your organization, has a little wisdom in it. I think this happened when I was in the early 90s, and I was trying to figure out what was something about my life story that would be leveraged into the future work that I was doing. But also as I was working with teenagers, I realized that we were often teaching them skills that could lead to wisdom, but we weren't necessarily giving them the end results of wisdom. So like in the faith community, we might say, read your Bible, right? Well, that's a pathway to wisdom, but that's not the conclusion of wisdom, We might tell them to pray or meditate, but that's a pathway, but that isn't the ultimate end state. So I really started trying to understand what is wisdom. The Hebrew scriptures seem to indicate that we can accelerate the acquisition of it. So I was like, how do we do that? How can we help teenagers accelerate the acquisition of wisdom? And that kind of just became a personal pursuit for me. And Wisdom Works just sounded like a good name that took something that was kind of high concept, but also married it with practice. And we started working with teenagers, trying to figure out how to help them to actually develop wisdom and ways of thinking in their life.
Yeah, I got kind of a similar story about why I landed on Into Wisdom. When I was in college, I read a book called, I think it was No Man is an Island by Martin Buber. And in it, he says, any education worthy of the name is the education of character. And that got me thinking of, how do you educate character? What does that look like? And it's more just than information transfer. To me, it's about acquiring wisdom, a lot what you landed on. Later on, I was reading T.S. Eliot, and in one of his poems, he talks about what has become of the wisdom we've lost in knowledge and the knowledge lost in information. And talking about, especially today, you back out and we deal in information for the most part. And information is interesting, but not helpful. Knowledge is information in context, which doesn't mandate how you use that. Wisdom is knowing how to use the knowledge that you've acquired in a way that is aligned with your mission, purpose, whatever it is. And so that's kind of how I landed into this whole into wisdom. How do we get back into wisdom on all this?
Yeah, there's kind of the whole, give a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. But give a man wisdom about fish, and he's gonna cook that fish. He's gonna find the best fish. He's gonna,
he's gonna farm the fish, cultivate the fish. Yeah.
Yeah, he's gonna have more time in his day because he catches the fish easier. I mean, there's something about wisdom that just makes everything better and enhances everything, and it gives us the ability to predict the future. I started realizing that wisdom was kind of a collection of patterns that we recognize, and that when I would go to a person seeking their wisdom, what I was basically saying is, examine my situation, the whole context of my life, run it through your pattern recognition system, and then help me figure out maybe what might be the right thing for me to do to achieve the most fulfilling outcome. And that was, that you started breaking it down, and you started thinking, oh yeah, there's some actual things here that we can teach for, that we can learn for, that we can live life in a way that increases the number of patterns that we're able to recognize or experience. But I realized that old people are typically wiser because they've lived more life, they've observed more patterns. What if you're intentionally teaching to observe the pattern, to find the pattern? Can we accelerate that?
Yeah, and like nowadays, and especially with the situation that I'm in, entering into the marketplace of coaching and consulting and instructional design, so many people, when I'm leading a workshop in the business world, they'll come in and say, just tell me what to do. And they want this silver bullet that directs them to behaviors. Tell me what I should be doing right now. And that's great, and it may get them functional. It may even increase the speed to functionality, but then they can't progress after that. They've got to keep on going back. And when you start to shoot towards the wisdom part of it, you realize it's going to be a slower process initially, but ultimately it's going to be longer lasting because, again, they've learned how to learn. They've learned how to do their own pattern recognition. If I give them the silver bullet they desire, is creating an addiction to just continuous information. But if you can help them, help people understand, if you go through this pattern recognition, I love that metaphor, the idea of pattern recognition, the idea of learning how to learn, the idea of the education of character, they don't become dependent on others to increase their wisdom. It becomes an intrinsic motivation to continue to grow.
Yeah, it's very resilient. It's very adaptive, to use some buzzy words.
Yeah.
But I think that is the thing. In complex times, wisdom is a very essential skill, because you need to be able to look through a complexity of situations and be able to navigate them. And wisdom is about the only thing that helps you kind of navigate the unknown.
Yeah. And appreciating the complexity of, so how often do you hear the phrase, it's complicated, which is basically code for saying, I don't want to deal with it. And yet when you start to appreciate the elegance of complexity, it moves you towards it. And then you can start to essentialize or look at the essence of whatever the issue is. And because you've dealt with the complexity, you can boil it down to deliver what that person needs, or what that company wants, or what that situation needs. But if you don't go through the complexity, you've got a simplistic answer that doesn't address any of that. And more often than not, will fall apart under scrutiny.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and as we, as there's more interactions with things, like a car is very complicated. It used to be, most of my teenage friends could take a car apart and then put it back together again. But now that's not really all that possible because cars have become more complicated. But complexity is now all of these cars interacting on the road with one another with changing patterns and time of day issues and things of that nature. And that's just where wisdom comes in. I can use a map and a set of tools to take that car apart and put it back together, even though it might be very complicated. But predicting when I should leave for something to get there at the right time, that's a complexity that requires a whole different set of wisdoms to be able to navigate.
Yeah, and so I do a lot of work with engineers in the accident reconstruction world and also in the insurance world. And so you're talking about self-driving cars. And the most interesting thing to me, and I think this is still the case, is the biggest obstacle to marketing and selling the purely autonomous vehicles isn't technology, it's metaphysics. Because do you design your automation so that the car ultimately protects the driver or protects the people around the driver? So it's that whole point of sacrifice. So do you, if the car has to make a choice of hitting a person and hurting the driver, or hitting multiple people, or so all of a sudden you've got this autonomous vehicle having to do metaphysics, and it's fascinating how that
moral decisions.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And they know, everybody says that they want autonomous vehicles to choose by what is the most good for the most people. But when they ask, would you buy that? No, I want one that's going to protect me.
Yeah. So. Yeah. It's very, very interesting how these mechanizations help us understand our humanity. Like I know when I got into robotics for a while, and it made me appreciate my humanity because I realized how complex we were, how difficult it was to replicate simple things with, through mechanical means. Yeah. And wisdom is one of those things that, who can say in that moment, who's going to make the decision in this element or the other to lead to a certain outcome. It's very interesting.
Yeah. So I want to transition a little bit to another topic here. Gosh, it must have been a couple of years ago. We were friends on Facebook, and you started, I'd have to say probably starting in, 2016, 2017.
It was a little bit before Trump. I started getting into some of this, but the Trump era kind of like somehow heightened everything.
Right. And what it is that on Facebook, you started to encourage thoughtful interaction in social media and asking and fostering the hard questions on your thread. Now, there's many people, including myself, think that social media is not the right platform to have these kind of nuanced discussions. What led you to thinking Facebook would be a good place for this?
Well, this Facebook, these were on my personal pages, but my personal page had 5,000 friends. Okay. But most of them I knew, or I at least knew where I met them if they were a friend. It wasn't just like, I live in my own little world and I don't know any of these people. These were people that were attending events that I'd done as teenagers. So I feel like I know almost all 5,000 of those people on some level. It's not true, but it feels that way. And I could probably, for the majority of them, one year I actually made it a point to wish everybody on my Facebook page happy birthday. And that was a discipline that I tried to get into. I didn't perfectly achieve that, but I literally had a chance to go through each one of those people and review them. And it was surprising to me how many of them I actually was like, oh, I remember meeting that kid, or I remember, doing this. They're not kids anymore. They're grown adults, but they were when I first met them perhaps. and or they were friends from elementary school or high school or whatever. But what I started posting some things, just, you know, things that I was struggling with, trying to reconcile, and just wanted other people's opinion. And what I realized was I had developed over, 40 some years of life, a really diverse group of people that really came from a lot of different places around the country, and a lot of different worldviews that probably would never personally be able to meet face to face, even if they wanted to, without getting in an airplane. And so that meant, I had, somebody who, was living in Manhattan, interacting with somebody who lived on a farm, and I was seeing their interactions and going, man, this is incredible, because the common thread was maybe that somehow they knew me somehow in some shallow way or a deep way, their family member or a good friend or church member, fellow church member, but that we had that my common connection created an environment or a space for people to maybe stick around difference longer than they normally would. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what it does, because you have this interesting history doing conferences and speaking different places, writing books, you came in contact with a lot of different types of people from all over the country.
A lot of them I came in contact with when they were younger, before they really formed their identities, but they still had some connection to me as they got older, maybe went different directions in life or whatever, but now they're still connected. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and all of a sudden, because you're all friends on Facebook, and most of them weren't willing to dump you if you said something silly or dumb or that they didn't agree with. And the other piece, what I find interesting, is that your Facebook group, they're not friends with each other. So if somebody says something controversial on your personal page, it's not like they can unfriend that person they're not friends with.
Correct. Right. They'd have to unfriend me. And,
right.
And some have. I mean, let's face it. I've lost the respect of a lot of people because I won't define some things, or I won't go places they'd like me to go. And that's the thing that's interesting, is a lot of times people will read my posts as if it's from their perspective.
Yes.
And even though that might be different than the next person who's reading that post and reading into it things from their perspective.
Right. They're reading it in their own voice.
Yes. And some of that's by design. I mean, I do a better job of that in some ways, but I would really carefully think, if I'm this person, what am I seeing in this? If I'm this person, what am I seeing? Because I know these people. So I was writing to prompt engagement and to help people see their difference. Because what I realized was that, there's a real interesting set of statistics on Meet the Press last year, where they were showing that people of like-minded ideologies actually choose to even vacation in places with people of similar ideologies. So effectively, even when we're traveling abroad or outside of our normal rhythm of life, we are totally insulating ourselves from difference. And that's what makes it easy to get so polarized, is we don't know how to deal with difference when we come into contact with it.
So there's real interesting, because it wasn't dealing with difference, it was dealing with associations. And this is, they did a study at a conference, at several conferences, where they put RFID tags in people's name tags, and they tracked who they hung out with.
Interesting.
And what they found is that even at networking events where you're supposed to be spreading out, and people who stated, I want to get to know new people, all hung out with their friends and very rarely ventured off into finding new people. Did the exact same types of study on college campuses, where you were truly going to a place where you knew nobody. So freshman orientation did the same study, and what they found is that people tended to associate with people who were very nearly exactly like themselves. So rural kids would find other rural kids to hang out with. City kids, same thing. Religious, Christian, tended to find their own denomination. Hobbies tended to find themselves, even though they are stepping into a totally anonymous situation when it comes to like college campus. So
Yeah.
what do you think? Because as you were talking about that, is it about avoiding difference or finding commonality and sticking to what you know?
Well, I think I think that's what I've noticed more than anything in watching these interactions. Most people would say, "Oh, I love being around people that are different than me." But because it's not something we normally do, we're shocked at how different people can be from us. Like, we just don't understand how the other, could think so crazy, from what we think. And I see that a lot in the political, spectrum. Right now in the discussion forum, we're talking a little bit about, I kind of posted a vulnerable post about being pro-life, but having some real questions about certain aspects of my convictions in the pro-life movement. And it was just amazing because, one, some people were like, how can you even ask these questions? You know what I mean? Like, there's that, like, how can you even doubt? I'm like, well, I'm just being honest that, when I try to figure out how to support this view or this element, I have a conviction, but I don't necessarily have an argument, a good sourced reason for this, even though I might have conviction around it. And then you'll have somebody say, well, I'm a Christian, and I totally believe that, women should have a right to choose, and da 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 da. And people are telling their stories, and, people are just blown away. How can you possibly be a Christian and feel this way? And so this difference is really critical.
Yeah, it's that particular, and I want just a second. I want you to tell the story of that new discussion group that you've created. But that particular question, because I lurk in there, and every once in a while I'll lob something in. But that question in particular, for me, it became not so much a moral issue or a theological issue or a legal political. It becomes more about epistemology. What can we know and how can we know it? And that's a whole different thing that I didn't want to throw that out there. But you're getting this idea of people are going, I know this. And I think it's attributed to Will Rogers. Somebody else said it's not the things that you know that get you into trouble. It's the things you know for sure that ain't true that get you in trouble. And there's a lot of stuff that we bring in there that we know for sure in our world, but we have never kind of explored what can we really know for sure, and what role does that play in my convictions? Because there's so many things we can't know for sure.
Well, some of this goes to this complexity issue too. Most of us really don't deal with the complexity of the laws that we live under, or the amount of options that are available every day. So we oversimplify. And I actually made this comment about, we're oversimplifying a moral discussion. It's kind of like a clash between an oversimplified moral position and a very complex legal life liberty question. Yeah. And yes, if you don't dive into it, it's real easy to say, well, there should just be a law that says you can't do this. But the problem is, at some point, a doctor has to make a decision about something. What guides him? How does he know what is legal or not, even when it's maybe something that we would say is okay, and like, even in the midst, some of these partial birth abortion laws, have been reduced to, you're allowing, a child to be killed at a certain stage in pregnancy. But those are pretty rare circumstances. And even the law makes it for a very rare circumstance, but there has to be a law that says when a doctor feels this is, necessary, how does he know that he's done what he needs to do to protect himself, So
yeah,
most of us aren't dealing with that kind of complexity, and these are really rare such circumstances, but they still have to have a legal set of principles around them, even though they may never, ever get enacted.
Which gets into the challenge of doing this on social media, whether you call it complexity or addressing the subtleties, whatever you want to do it. Social media in in your attempt to be brief or to use the format, you tend to lean on logical fallacies quite a bit that abbreviate your comment, abbreviate your argument so that you can get to the point faster, because a lot of people don't have the patience to wade through that much text. And so you create these false equivalencies, you create these exceptions to make the rule, all that kind of stuff. And this kind of gets us towards, why did you choose to create your own discussion group? I know it's called the Matlock discussion group, whatever, and you're thinking about changing that. But what led you to kind of double down on social media as a place to have these nuanced and complex discussions?
Well, first of all, I'll always fight for live in-person conversations. I think that's always the best way to do things. But like I said before, the fact that getting any of these people in the room together, I mean, I have a hard enough time, and some of these people are my friends, meeting up with them when I travel to their areas. Sometimes I'll post that I'm in a certain part of the country, and they'll be like, why didn't you call me? I was down the street from where and it's like, and so the challenge of getting people in the room together is a lot harder, but I always prefer that. So I just want to start off with that. Primacy of face-to-face is always the best. But the reason I created the special kind of private room was, one, to love my wife, who was really just, sometimes being frustrated because people that did not want to be a part of conversations like this were getting exposed to all of this. And it was causing some havoc, just personally. So now the only people that are in this, they understand the rules and all of that. So we've created this special forum. And that was the other reason, was I wanted to create some rules, some guiding principles, maybe some form of community around that. So one of the things that I'm choosing to do is, one, I started addressing issues like logical fallacies, things like that. So we can learn, how to argue, or at least present our ideas better without the holes. And promoting intellectual honesty is a really important value to me. The other thing was to help promote civility. And, sometimes people are not civil to one another, even in our thing, even though it's part of the rules, it happens, right? But I set some ground rules that if you're a part of this forum, you're not here to change anybody's mind, but to learn more about how somebody different than you thinks. And that was really important. I couldn't do that just on an open Facebook post because I couldn't get everybody to agree to those rules. And so putting it in the forum allows us to, have some shared guiding principles of how we want to interact. And it's still a young experiment, to see how that works. And then I try to take Sundays as a time to reflect on things that you've learned the previous week. And so getting people to learn about how we're interacting with one another is also an important part of the process.
That's a great feature because, what I've learned about learning is that if you don't stop, if you don't put a period on your experience, it's hard to figure out what you've learned. And so just taking that breath on Sundays to be able to say, what did you learn this week, allows them to kind of encode it and go, okay, this is my learning for this week, Well,
that was the idea is, I'm a big fan of reflection. That's obviously a part of developing wisdom, right? And realizing that in most situations, people are just going from post to post and they're dropping their angst or venting. And if we don't take time to reflect and just to kind of say, hey, what am I learning here? What's uncomfortable for me? It's really difficult to learn and to grow.
Yeah. And I've noticed, I think you started this at end of November, beginning of December, right in there.
Yes.
And I've noticed over the last couple of months, number one, it started off with people were sneaking in and doing personal attacks and getting really snarky.
Yeah, nobody was sneaking in. That just was what happened right out of the
Yeah. And
everybody that came initially was invited, but it was much more, it was charged initially. Yeah.
Yeah, because people were used to that kind of interaction online. Now what I'm seeing is a lot more, sometimes it's a little bit more hidden snark, but people are starting to, they dropped assuming people had bad intent. and are now reading the post of these. And where you've got to be, you've got to dedicate yourself to reading one of the threads, because they're thoughtful, long, and very kind of open responses. And there's some people who couldn't handle that, and you saw those people lash out and then get corrected by the rest of the community right away. So I think even in just 2 months, you're seeing the quality of discourse get increasingly better. And there's, like, if I were going to do a course on social media discourse, in that discussion forum, there's great examples, especially early on, of how ugly it can be. But there's also some wonderful examples of people coming from really tremendously different perspectives that are just doing their best to try and understand why that is so. And you just see these great questions back and forth where they're finding the assumptions that they themselves were making. So there's some really encouraging stuff.
Well, this is why I would say that social media can be a great environment for people to engage. One, I have to articulate my thoughts in writing. There is something powerful about articulating your thoughts before you hit post, or even just articulating them and posting them. But when we're talking, we can go all over the map. But when we're writing, we have to be a little more thoughtful about what we're putting down and typing in, and we can review it before we, hit send. But the best part is there's a record there. And so you can go back and look it over and, and learn from it. People can reference back to it. People are able to engage in different periods of time with the topic. I have a lot of people on there that, are like, man, I love being a part of this, but I would never, ever post a response or leave a comment. And a lot of that's because they learn from watching other people, but not necessarily weighing in. And that's the other beauty of that. I mean, you can do that live too, where you have people observe conversation that's happening, but it's nice having that record of that. I mean, I'm learning a lot just, being able to go back and see things and, review things and go, oh, that's interesting. How that was framed.
And it's funny because the anonymity of social media makes it easy to troll and snark and all that kind of stuff. Even though your name's up there, it's easy to do that. But I think one of the lessons that I'm seeing here, and I think others are too, is that yes, you can thoughtlessly post and react, or you can thoughtfully craft a response. And I think people are seeing that when you thoughtfully craft a response, it takes you so much further than the snark,
Yeah, well, and that's been the hard part for me is I've blown it a few times by not carefully thinking through my post, and either being too not well focused, or just not even thinking through my own, what I'm trying to accomplish there. It takes time to curate it too. I mean, if I'm involved, sometimes these things take a life of their own, and people are starting to get to know who the people are on the forum too, right? They're starting to really build some, some sense of, okay, I know where this person's coming from. And we asked people to post an introduction. I think what was interesting in that for me was how many people in their introductions were talking about how they came to know me. Because a lot of the initial people on here were friends of mine, and so that was fun for me to kind of see these connections and other people connecting and other people going, hey, I see that you're a friend of so-and-so too, and I know this person or whatever. And but yeah, it's Facebook is a little less anonymous because you are attached to your profile.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, helps people interact with a little more integrity.
Well, and especially in this type of a format where sometimes you can jump into somebody else's post or whatever, and nobody else knows you in there. Somehow you were able to see it. Here, because of the way you've structured it, you've got to be true to you've got to be connected to your profile, and people can learn about you and all that. So, so much more we could explore around that. But I want to turn the corner and ask, what have you learned about the divides that we have right now? What is truly, if you had to define how we are divided, what would that be? What have you learned from curating these discussions?
I think um, what I'm seeing um, is, where do you get your primary source of values? A lot of these things are coming, I'm either getting it from the scriptures or I'm getting it from the Constitution. And so there's kind of two documents that are, so like even on the on this issue of abortion, right? Some people are saying, look, my values are coming out of scripture, how I feel about life. Other people are saying, you know what, I still hold to that value that life is precious, but the Constitution has a value over liberty and privacy, and I would much rather have a woman dealing with her doctor than having a law that's dictating what she can or can't do. And so there's like, it's like these values, the source of them are coming in from different places, and I think what we're seeing in our polarization of media and what I would call a post-truth culture is that I can see where people are being influenced by their media outlets, and some, while some may be slanted one way or the other, sometimes there's a different value set around how those facts are filtered and achieved. And so I think that all journalism, because of the very nature of what journalism is about, will always tend to, if it's valid and it's really pushing for truth, it's always going to tilt a little bit more left than right, because it doesn't give institutions and people the benefit of the doubt. And so it always is pushing and always feels it has a right to something that maybe other people would say, I don't think it matters. So conservative news outlets, I always feel, are a little disadvantaged when it comes to pushing for truth, because there's an institutional filter that is respected by the very nature of conservatism and tradition. That said, it's amazing to me how much bad information is out there, and you can see how fast it spreads. Yeah. So that's a big part of it too, is just, where is that trusted source of truth? That's foundationally the divider.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. So, talking about media and sources, you go back towards the founding of our nation, and if you read any of the biographies of Washington, Adams, Hamilton, the newspapers were all run by factions. And so I'm surprised. It's actually shocking to me, this whole, like, the freedom of the press. It was either you totally control the press or don't do it at all. But all the newspapers were supporting factions in the government, even before the Constitution, even before the Revolution. You had the papers that just published the stuff that was loyalist, the papers that just published stuff that was pro-colonial. And so, you got things early on, just incredible. What we call fake news now is nothing compared to what was going on in the late 17, early 1800s. And I think we forget.
And yet we still believe the free press was really valuable to be able to combat and have that exchange of ideas.
Yeah, I think about even New York. It was all faction, Tammany Square, and then reformers, until you had one paper that I think they called it the penny paper or something like that. And what they did, they just published everything that was interesting to people for a penny, drove off advertising rather than sponsorship. And all of a sudden you had this neutral idea of a paper. So it's just fascinating to me how the assumption that we have, I think it comes from the 40s and 50s and Edward R. Murrow and these people who gave an ethic to journalism. Before that, like papers had no reason to be, balanced and thorough like that. They were sponsored by some publisher or another that had an agenda. So I'm sure I'll get some corrections on that, but that's how I've read history. So I think it's really fascinating how we're leaning on the truth in media, when I don't know that even the best media can't escape the bias of what they choose to report.
Yeah, well, yeah, and those ethics and standards, just even like nowadays, you can't even find out who owns some news outlets and all of that. But even just the ability to even discern between whether you're reading opinion or you're looking at reporting, even that distinction is hard for a lot of people. They're kind of like, well, yeah, I'm getting all my news from from this commentator. Well, they're not really. They're more opinion. You're looking at
Yeah,
filtered and curated news. You're not really just getting kind of reporting.
yeah,
And even that, even just general reporting can often be biased, but still it's being held to a different set of standards. Like Sean Hannity, you know, tries to avoid the term "I'm a journalist," or whatever, because he knows that requires him to hold to a standard he doesn't.
right.
He's not trying to abide by.
Yeah, and I gotta say, like, a friend of mine, Alan Hilton, wrote a book called "A House United," and he looked at the sociology behind a lot of this stuff, and he goes back to a lot of this comes from when we started to get cable channels, and before that, he goes to a Saturday Night Live skit of Point Counterpoint, where Jane Curtins and Dan Aykroyd would sit there on the same stage and give an opinion, and Aykroyd would come back with, "Jane, you ignorant slut." And what this has to do with anything is the fact that we were all watching the same news. We had three choices, and everybody had the same foundation for discussion because we all watched the same thing. When we got cable channels, all of a sudden there were so many different outlets for news that we didn't have this common theme to discuss. Everybody would bring their foundation that came from their preferred news source. So all of a sudden, you're not having you're not speaking the same language because you're not starting with the same. I won't call them facts, but you're not starting on this with the same bit of information. So
Well,
immediately,
the
you're not talking the same.
motivation for the news changed, right? If I've got an entire channel that's dedicated to news, I have to keep something on it. And sitting down, I mean, I'm sure there's a time when I'm sure editors were sitting there going, "We got too much stuff to fit into an hour. What are we not going to put in there?" And now it's probably like, we need something to fill the time. And
Yeah.
that need for attention, the attention economy, all those types of things. I remember watching I think it was the first press conference for the newly formed uh, Homeland Security, and they were basically talking about like kits that you should have in your home and what you would need to keep your house safe. And anthrax was a threat at the time and all this, but it was boring. And so they've kind of got the live feed on and they're doing it. And all of a sudden, I had two different channels on in different rooms. And there was a dog that was stranded on an iceberg, and a guy in a kayak was trying to rescue the dog. All of a sudden, they pivoted off of the story of the Homeland Security director to to this dog being saved. And then all of a sudden, the other news channel switched to the dog on the iceberg, and then another one, and it was kind of like, we're losing eyeballs,
Yep.
eyeballs. Quick, dog on an iceberg, dog on an iceberg.
Compelling images that bleeds,
Yeah,
that leads.
yeah, but
Yeah.
yet what this guy with the Homeland Security guy was talking about was of vital importance to our lives. But it was like, hey, we'll give you the summary later, and it'll be a lot easier to implement than watching this 30-minute speech. So
Yeah, yeah, and that's yeah. So that's kind of the that divide being so fundamentally about how we get our information and kind of our a priori assumptions around the information. Um, I do think it's one of the things that your forum is doing is helping people see. Oh, we may never come to agreement, but you can teach me something about how I think.
yeah, I think so. And I think there are a lot of people that are kind of interested in other people. I mean, we are, as people, we are the most interesting thing in the room, right? I love trees and I love animals and I love the sky and the clouds. I love standing by the ocean. But let's face it, people are still the most interesting thing out there. And I think that there is a part of people that's like, I want to see more interesting people. And I think, and once people start going, I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm not trying to convert you. I'm not trying to shame you, but I really am kind of curious. How do you get there?
Yeah.
Or how did you arrive at this? That becomes a really fascinating thing for people.
Yeah, man, so much more on this topic, but we're kind of coming up. I like being able to do long format stuff, but not too long. So
Yeah.
I want to close this stuff, and at some point, I think it'd be really interesting to do a Facebook Live conversation like this, maybe even sponsored by your channel, just to see what comes of it. But I want to wrap things up here with some rapid fire questions, just for kicks.
Okay.
And again, you don't have to. I won't hold you to these answers. You can change your mind anytime after this about how you answer this. But first one is really quick. Who would you consider your hero?
Who would I consider my hero? There's a lot of people I look up to in my life, but I would say, my dad is probably the one that I look up to the most and would consider to be my hero.
Why your dad? What are
I think because, my dad has always been somebody who's always been consistent in his views, careful about when he speaks and how he thinks. Um, he, looking at how he raised my brothers and I, he identified uniquenesses in each of us and became the support person to that uniqueness, as opposed to trying to make us follow him. He kind of adapted to us, and I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, next one here. What are you doing on an ongoing basis for your own development, for your continued learning?
I always set aside days that are just for me, that are for me to read what I want to read, to watch what I want to watch, to go somewhere that I want to go. The amount of time can change from year to year, but I always kind of designate a amount of time, because especially as your life gets filled with more relationships, it's really easy for time off to become family time, and you don't have anything inside of you. And I can't give anything away if I don't have something inside of me. Yeah. And so I try to find that time and calendar it, and budget for it as well. I actually spend money to do experiences that are purely for me to explore something in my life. I've had vocal coaches. At times I hired a director and a playwright to help me write some stories from my life that I wanted to think about through a different lens. So I've done some things like that are fun.
Well, one of the things I appreciate about you, almost every conversation we have, you say something like, "Hey, have you ever heard about fill in the blank?" And it always comes from someplace different. So I really appreciate that about our conversations.
I'm hardwired to explore. Not everybody is,
yeah.
And so if that's not you, find somebody who is and be their friend, and ask them, what are you reading? What interesting things are you coming up with? Yeah. Because there are people that are hardwired. I can't not help it. If I go online and search for something, I click all the links to the link to the link to the link, and because exploring is a big part of who I am.
Yeah. So speaking of reading and all that kind of stuff, what author do you find yourself quoting most?
Oh man, that's a tough one.
Well, how about this? Who, Solomon? The whole wisdom thing?
Solomon. Yeah, Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. That literally is probably who I cite more than anybody, and have memorized more of their work than anybody's. Yeah.
So, other than your own books, is there a book that you tend to give out a lot to other people? What's the most recent or your favorite book to give to someone? Other than Faith for Exiles, because that one's awesome anyhow.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what book that would be. I don't actually give a lot of books away. but man, I'm trying to think of, there's something that's in my mind and I'm kind of not recalling it. But I know for business leaders, The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni has been a book that I've recommended to a lot of people. Seth Godin's The Gap. That's a book that I've given to a lot of people. And what's great is Seth makes it available for free on PDF. So it's an easy thing to send to people. But it's a simple little book, takes less than 45 minutes to read, and it has some profound ideas when you're stuck about, what to do. Do you lean into the gap or do you get out of the gap? And it's just a great little book that I found to be really helpful.
Well, those are two good ones. Thanks. And appreciate those connections there. Hey, Mark, thank you for spending the time that you have with me today. And this is just some really great stuff. I'm hoping that people will comment on this with their thoughts about social media, their thoughts. I mean, we went to some interesting places from wisdom to social media to newspapers, all that kind of stuff. So thanks for the time. And I look forward to more conversations like this.
Yeah, it'd be interesting in like a month or so to follow up and see how the forum's doing.